architecture is not a cocktail, as he used to say. It is a serious matter that has to be thought about, and what he strived to do and to think about and in his work, and I do that in my own way, is how to express our time through the buildings.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Architecture Articulated, conversations hosted by Dom Publishers. For all that don't know us, we are a Berlin-based publishing house specializing in architecture with a particular focus on architecture in Eastern Europe. I'm Björn Rosen, the publishing director at Dom, and you can also find us online at dom-publishers.com. And you are joining us, in fact, today for the very first episode of Architecture Articulated. We are launching this new video series because normally we would be in Frankfurt today for the International Book Fair, but as you all know, probably it's not taking place this year due to the coronavirus, only digitally, and this is our contribution. For this opening episode, we have two very special guests with us. We will be talking about Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, perhaps the most important representative of modern architecture in the 20th century. Our recent publication, The Lost Last Words of Mies van der Rohe, is centered on a tape recording of conversations between Mies and his grandson, Dirk Lohan. And Dirk Lohan is with us today. Hello, Anne. I'm very pleased to have you with us. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this conversation. Just to introduce you to our audience, Dirk Lohan is also an architect. He was born in Germany, but he has spent most of his life in the United States. Today, he is joining us from Chicago, though what you can see in the background is not the Lake Michigan, but it's a picture showing Norway, as far as I know, the Lofoten. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that later on. Dirk Lohan studied architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology under his grandfather Mies van der Rohe, and later at the Technische Hochschule, now the Technische Universität in Munich. As a young architect, he worked closely with Mies on projects such as Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin and the Toronto Dominion Center. Dirk Lohan has designed a number of hotels, including the Four Seasons in Mumbai, but also the Oceanarium in Chicago. He was a senior principal of Lohan Associates for many years, and since his recent retirement, he has been working privately as an architectural consultant. And this leads me to our second guest today, Fritz Neumeyer. He's one of the foremost experts on Mies van der Rohe, and he was in fact the editor of The Lost Last Words, for which he also contributed an introductory essay. His 1986 book, The Artless Word, has become a seminal text in the field of architectural theory, and he has served as a professor of architectural history and theory at Dortmund and Princeton universities, and also the Technical University of Berlin. Professor Neumeyer lives in Berlin, in fact, but in the spirit of social distancing, we have decided to do this meeting completely on Zoom or via Zoom. Professor Neumeyer, also very pleased to have you with us today. Hello. My first question, though, goes to Mr. Lohan, Dirk Lohan. I think even people who are not that familiar or not that interested in architecture know about your grandfather's projects or about some of them. The Weissenhof estate in Stuttgart, the Seagram building in New York, to name just a few. Which projects do you consider to be the highlight among Mies's works?
Well, there are a number of them, but I think Mies's career really breaks down into two very distinct phases. One in Europe, in Berlin, and then the other half of his professional life in the United States, in Chicago. So out of the Berlin period, there are several buildings that he designed, and only a very few, but the Tugendhat House in Czechoslovakia, or in the Czech Republic, is very well known, is now part of the World Heritage System. And it's a wonderful private residence for a wealthy industrial family in Brno, Brünn, in the German language. And of course, he's also the architect and designer of the Barcelona Pavilion, which was in 1929 World's Fair in Barcelona, and was widely recognized and talked about and published, but removed because it was a temporary building. But in several years ago, maybe, when was it, in the 80s or 90s, it was rebuilt. I was part of the team that advised on that project, and it's now a landmark in Europe. In the United States, you mentioned already the Seagram building in New York City. It's a high-rise office building, very distinguished and very well known. And in Chicago, the building actually I'm living in is the 860, 880 North Lakeshore Drive apartment buildings. They're two 26-story high-rise buildings that were built in 1952. They are very famous in the United States. They're landmark, they're protected. And another one, perhaps equally well known, is Crown Hall, the School of Architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where I spent some time myself as a young architect. Yes.
I already said it, the background, that's not the Lake Michigan, but you mentioned before our conversation that you actually look at the Lake Michigan. So the other side is the lake.
Yeah, I am facing my iPad screen, but I'm looking out over Lake Michigan. And the picture behind me is a painting that I haven't had in my family for many, many years, from 1909 by a German painter, Karl Böhme. And it is a landscape painting that I love very much because of the sky and the sea, the way it's depicted from of the Lofoten Islands north of Norway in the Arctic Circle. The painting is fairly large, 2 meters maybe by 1.50 meters, something like that.
Wow.
And I think it makes a wonderful background.
Yes, yes. I should say you had a very close relationship with Mies, but interestingly, you didn't really get to know him until the year 1957 when you started your architectural studies at the Illinois Institute of Technology. You were 19 years old at the time, I think.
Yes, that is correct. I was 19 years old when I decided after my Abitur in Germany to go to Chicago and start architecture. However, it's not quite correct that I didn't meet him before. Actually, he met me when I was born, before he went to America. Yeah. That I do not remember, of course. But I do remember when he came in 1952 to visit Germany for the first time after World War II.
Yes.
And he visited us, my mother being his daughter, and in Freiburg, the Black Forest. And I did spend some time with him then on a car ride through the forest, to the Black Forest. Just he and I, with a driven chauffeur car. And I was 14 years old. I also attended at that time, and I'm sure this was all very carefully orchestrated by my mother, I was allowed to sit with a group of local German architects who had asked if they could meet me in a very fine restaurant on Domplatz. And I sat at the end of the table as a 14-year-old listening to the senior architects talking about their work, their careers, and what's important.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed, and this may have had some subconscious influence on me wanting to become an architect.
Right. Actually, in your foreword to the Lost Last Words, you write, and I quote, "I had a long fascination with architecture." So I was wondering if that fascination, or to which degree that fascination had to do with your distant yet somehow very well-known grandfather.
Well, in my family, it was pretty natural. I mean, obviously, my mother received as a wedding present from her father before he left for America, some interior furniture pieces and the design of an apartment, her first apartment where my parents lived and I was born. That was quite Miesian. There were Mies chairs and the chaise longue and so on, and rattan mats on the floor. So I grew up in that environment, and then later, after World War II, when Mies became very successful and very active in the United States with new projects, he sent regularly these very wonderful 8x10 black and white photographs of his work, like Crown Hall, 860, 880 apartments, here this one. And my mother gave these to me, and I plastered my room, my bedroom, with these pictures of Chicago architecture. So that's my fascination with it, yes.
I see. Professor Neumeyer, coming to you. Mies, born in Aachen in Western Germany in 1886, received peculiarly, I would say, very little formal education. He never attended university. His biographer, Franz Schulze, attributes his career to, I quote, "a combination of talent, will, and extraordinary self-education." What's your explanation for this will to self-educate? Do you have any?
Well, that's a very, very difficult question, which I'm afraid not able to really to answer, because it touches psychological arguments. It touches the whole period in social terms and industrial terms of the early years which Mies lived on, and there is I think after 1900 there is a rather how to say eminent shift in what's going on in culture and in architecture as well. I think that is to me it is a personal gift that Mies has, and I always admired also the strength of his point of view. He seemed to know quite well what would be the essential part of something which he had to do, and and at that time I would say it was not so exceptional, because many artists and architects of that period are self-educators, and it might have to do also with this Nietzschean impulse of the turn of the century, where the artist becomes a kind of modern human being that educates itself. As Nietzsche says, the first ones have to educate themselves. So they don't want to be followers. Although Mies in these terms is an independent spirit. So he is not someone who completely rejects that there have been others before him, but he tries to learn from them. And but he has a strong independent idea of what is for him significant and important.
In your book, The Artless Word, you describe the formative influence of Mies's father, who was a stonemason. And in addition, you write that Mies developed a respect for materials of all kinds, that he developed an almost religious relationship with all things material. How is that reflected in his architecture?
Oh, what a question. Well, I mean, just take one of Mies's buildings, you know. First of all, they are really built. They are not just put together. They're really built. This is what architecture is about. It starts with building, and Mies understood architecture foremost as the art of building. It was not something which came from some kind of visual idea or imagery, but which comes from putting things together and putting things together in a careful manner so that that makes sense how they are put together and that it also appeals to your senses. And maybe that's part of the business of the stonemason as well. But coming to the Lohan tapes, I mean, I really was surprised to realize that this confrontation with material obviously hasn't been so largely defined through stone, but through stucco, because this is one of the insights that these tapes give. Mies spent, for example, 2 years in an Aachen stucco company as a draughtsman, with drawing ornaments and a one-to-one scale ornaments, so that someone could make a model out of it, and then it could be cast into a plaster and so on. And I was amazed to realize that he is doing this for 2 years, and he's not speaking in some kind of demeaning manner about it. On the opposite, because he says that this is where I learned, you know, that form doesn't exist independently from the material and from the process of the production. It's not just an invention, you know. Form is something which is connected to the idea as well as to the matter and the process of dealing with this material. So that's a very different attitude from those artists, architects of that period of time, you know, who also were brilliant draughtsmen, but then had a formal training at the academy and so on, but had their ideas of what an interesting, let's say, form should look like. And this is not the way Mies approached architecture. He approached it really from the side of making it, dealing with material, giving it a form, and thinking about the process, how it can be really set into a construction.
Regarding his, sorry, please jump in.
If I may add a little anecdote about this. Obviously, and Fritz mentioned it, Mies had a distinct talent as a draftsman. He was very good at drawing and sketching, and the people that employed him realized this rather quickly, and that's one of the reasons he advanced as a very young man. Yeah. But he comes from this idea of craft and doing something correctly, well built, well put together, and as he said, you know, when you put one brick carefully on top of another brick, that's when architecture begins. But I remember a humorous moment late in his life when he said, and that was probably said after he had a martini or two, that he could still with his left hand behind his back draw a Baroque ceiling ornament. And he moved his arm.
He also mentioned it. He mentioned this in the conversation with you, where he says, "I still can draw a cartouche without looking at it." And so, because I think that is also, to me, telling something about the Miesian architecture. You know, it has a physical dimension, and this moving of the arms, it's a bodily gesture, it's the haptic, and that creates a form. It's not something, you know, which has no contact with the physical bodily world. And that's why Mises buildings have always this bodily quality. They're really buildings that have a weight, and not just a couple of lines drawing against the sky.
Professor Neumeyer, you also write that by the 1920s, we are talking Weimar Republic here, Mies had been part of Berlin's Schinkelian tradition for a long time. I'm not sure if I did pronounce that correct. So it's about the German architect Schinkel. This may maybe come as a surprise to a lot of people who associate Mies mainly with steel and glass and skyscrapers. Could you explain more about Mies and his relationship with the works of Schinkel, please?
Well, the works of Schinkel, Mies came in touch with through Peter Behrens, mainly, when he was working for him in his office in Neubabelsberg. And Behrens was, at 1910, the great discoverer of Schinkel's work. And it is said that if someone would visit the studio of Behrens in Babelsberg, he would be picked up at the S-Bahn station, and before he would be driven to the studio of Behrens, he would be taken to the Charlottenhof of Schinkel. I don't know whether this is real, but si non è vero, e bene trovato. You know, it's a nice story. It tells something. Schinkel becomes rediscovered around 1910, and that is through Behrens that Mies also discovers him. And he is really able to see Mies, Schinkel, not only in, let's say, stylistic terms, but he understands him architecturally. He understands Schinkel's balancing of symmetry and asymmetry in the ground plan, the balancing of masses. There is no strong symmetry in the building. There's always something that contradicts it. The strong relation between inside and outside, the relation between architecture and nature. All these topics, these fascinate Mies in the 20s, and they fascinate him till the end of his life. So that is one thing. And the first houses of Mies, think of the house Perls, is obviously a kind of gesture towards Schinkel's architecture. It resembles a little bit the Schinkel pavilion at the Schloss Charlottenburg. And the owner, the Hugo Perls, was of the same age as Mies, 27 years old at this time or something, or 23. He was an art collector, and they both were admirers of Schinkel. There's a letter that says we met in our admiration for Schinkel. So that is the one thing, but it is no longer this kind of the style of neoclassicism. It is more a deeper understanding of Schinkel's modernity, I would say, in terms of the architectural composition. And this, by the way, then was for the first time realized in an essay in 1927, when Paul Westheim, who was the editor of the Kunstblatt, a famous art journal of the 20s, who wrote the first article on Mies's architectural work, not only on a single building, but on all his work. This is the first article that appears 1927. And he compares him being, so to speak, the most talented Schinkel disciple, because you don't see this Schinkel connection. And he relates it also to the circulation in the ground floor and so on and so on. I don't know whether Mies would have liked it or not, or has liked it or not, because just having become the director for the Stuttgart Weissenhof exhibition, it might be in avant-garde circles not the best recommendation to be labeled as the most talented and gifted Schinkel disciple of the time. So, but this is a strong influence in Mies's understanding of architecture, more in terms of the space. I think it's very important.
Coming back to you, Dirk Lohan. I already mentioned that Mies had little formal education, but on the other hand, he was considered a dedicated teacher. And of course, he was also your teacher. I think you wrote in the foreword that you or that he taught you how to drink and smoke, but of course that's not what I mean. More importantly, you worked together with him as an architect. So what did he teach you about architecture, or what is maybe which principles are maybe even reflected in your work, which Mies's principles are reflected in your work?
Well, I have to mention that teaching that was really influential was more my personal relationship with him and the many hours of conversations and discussions, and also some of the trips we took together. He later in the 60s, after I had been there a couple of years or so, I was regularly taken on trips with him, and I met interesting people and went to different cities and places and so on. So it's these discussions, and of course I was working during the day in the office, and then in the evening over dinner, let's say we talked about things that we were working on, and I may have brought some drawings with me, and we looked at them. And as was his habit, he had in his coat pocket here, behind his handkerchief that is famous, that always sticks out, was some sharpened pencil. And he would take it and maybe make a line or two, a very simple, very little things to make a suggestion. And it's that kind of learning, more like an apprentice, I like to think. It wasn't an intellectual learning, although he exposed me, of course, also to the books he liked to read, such as the philosophy books that Fritz Neumeyer wrote so much about. And but my own work, I mean, I have from day one, particularly at the time of his death, I decided that I would go my own way, but influenced by him, but not become an architect that continues to do for the rest of his life Mies buildings.
Sure.
So yeah. I have interpreted the world in my own way, and I am very pleased, particularly that I've learned to take things seriously. Architecture is not a cocktail, as he used to say. It is a serious matter that has to be thought about, and what he strived to do and to think about and in his work, and I do that in my own way, is how to express our time through the buildings that we design and that we do. And hopefully they become contributions to a betterment of our world.
Dirk, is this story true about Mies's teaching? Because when he came to Chicago, his English was rather poor. He couldn't express verbally. That I don't know, maybe Myron Goldsmith purported it. This was called teaching through silence. And
yes, that is, he's famous for that.
Yeah, that the students had to hang up their designs, and then the chair was moved in front of his Mies, sat down, lighted a cigar, and they were looking at these drawings, and Mies didn't say anything for a couple of minutes, and then only said, "Tja, yeah." Yeah. And everyone seemed to know.
There are numerous stories like that from students, former students of his. He took his good time to look at things. It's same thing with the work in the office. Sometimes we built, for instance, for the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin, we made a very nice big elevation on one of the walls in the office that was in the scale of 1 to 5, a fifth.
Oh.
And he came and looked at it and sat there, I don't know, an hour maybe, didn't say a peep. and then he said, well, maybe we should think about raising the corners slightly so that visually the elevation looks correct and doesn't look like the corners are hanging down. Yeah. And we tried that then in the model, and he came again, and we looked at it, and eventually we zeroed in on 10 centimeters. They're 4 inches, 10 centimeters raised.
Yeah.
And that gives the building the right form, or the refined form, which is sort of like the Greek methodology of visual improvements.
Yes. Nice.
You already mentioned that Mies was, of course, forced to leave Germany in 1938, and he left for the United States. He was, I don't know, around 50 years old at that time, and he did not speak English. I mean, maybe he spoke a few words.
He was 52 years old, yeah.
Yeah, that
he
was
did
it.
not speak English, no.
Yeah.
Very little, and it took him, of course, a good while to pick up enough to be able to speak, but he was surrounded by a couple of former Bauhaus students, 2 Americans, that he hired to teach with him. So they expressed his thoughts to his students in the beginning. And what is amazing to me, and I have marveled at this repeatedly over time, that we are now talking during World War II. There's a German coming just before the war, can't speak English, gets a position as a director of the architecture school, and is allowed to teach, even though he doesn't speak the language, during that period of time. It's phenomenal, in my opinion, and that was possible. And that probably applied to a good number of emigres from Nazi Germany, other people in other schools that came. And America was very welcoming and very open at that time. I wonder today, it probably wouldn't work at all.
Mr. Lohan, you always spoke German to him, or did you also speak?
We spoke in my many years of conversations with him. We spoke German about his life, but we spoke English when we discussed a project that was in Chicago, let's say. Obviously, because everything was done in English. But at the same time, in the 60s, there were several German projects, particularly in addition to the Neue Nationalgalerie, also the Krupp in Essen, Verwaltungsgebäude für Krupp, das im Büro, in the office was being worked on. And there were a couple of other German young fellows that worked with us on these projects. And for instance, Christoph Sattler from Munich was in the office, Rolf Weisse from Berlin, Burkhard Bergius in Berlin. These are people that were in the office in those days.
How different was, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, well, so I mean, the language was being flipped, but by that time in the 60s, he spoke fairly good English, but he had developed a pattern and a habit when asked a question of taking some time to think about the answer. And I've often wondered, and my suspicion is, he learned to do that because he was formulating the phrase, how to answer it in English. And he needed a little time to do that in his head before he immediately answered it, you see.
Yeah.
And that made him come across as this very taciturn, but thoughtful, almost philosophical personality.
So it was actually a misunderstanding then?
Well, that's a suspicion I have. I don't know, but
Yeah.
It worked beautifully.
Yeah, I was about to ask you how different was the English-speaking Mies from the German-speaking Mies, because I learned from your book, or from the Lohan tapes rather, that his humor, for example, seemed to work better in German than in English.
Yes.
And of course, humor is always something that has to be very precise to work. So I guess it's always difficult in a foreign language.
Yes, absolutely correct. And it makes good sense when you think about it. You're 52 years old and have to learn a new language. I mean, you're full of your mother tongue that doesn't leave you.
Right.
I've been now for over 50 years in the United States, and I came here when I was in around 20. And I still speak fluent German without accent. So I'm truly bilingual.
Yeah. My next question goes to Professor Neumeyer, but is actually related to this topic. Mies had the image of being a very reserved man of few words, as was mentioned, especially compared to other architects or great architects of the 20th century, let's say Le Corbusier. And the Lohan tapes, or rather the recently published transcript, is not very long. And nonetheless, it serves as an important primary source, right, for understanding Mies. How different is the Mies we see in these conversations from the figure we see in other texts?
Well, I think not so much different as a person, but we see more of this person. For example, just as you mentioned, this kind of humor. For example, Mies never criticized any person publicly. Never, ever. I don't know of any of these things. And also in the private, as it seems in the private conversation, like the one he leads with his grandson, with Dirk, this kind of criticism is disguised and there is some irony and humor. And this is only if you know the facts behind the words, you can realize that this is humorous, if not a little bit sarcastic, what he says. So, for example, when he speaks about Philip Johnson's time as a student at Harvard, when he says the pure student, you know, and if you know that Philip Johnson at this time was a multimillionaire and lived in a hotel with an English butler as a student, you get the irony in these words. So if you just read them, you wouldn't realize it. And so I think there are other cases like this also when he speaks about Gropius, whom he didn't like very well. There are these ironical statements that show that there is a person which has a grand humor. So it must be wonderful to talk with him in a private way in German, and there are a couple of tapes that haven't been published that I know, where they met, for example, in the apartment of George Danforth with other architects or artists that came by in Chicago, and then they had an evening with drinks and had the tape started. So it's a situation where Mies, this is, to me, the big value of these tapes, speaks in a different way, because he knows this is not meant to be publicized. It's a private conversation, and it is in German, which allows him to be much more eloquent and much more with nuances in what he is saying. And I think also at that time in the 60s, Mies got a little bit sick about these interviews, because these interviews by television or magazines, also they adopted after Mies was showered in gold medals from the late 50s and 60s, and they asked him almost the same typical questions about his life, the Bauhaus, famous buildings, and so on. And the answers of Mies in these interviews, they become seemingly standardized. So, and he repeats himself and quotes himself basically. Whereas here in these private talks, he is in a completely different mood, you know, and that this is what you can read between the lines, also in the lines, and also between the lines of this transcript of the conversation. This
maybe at this point it might be appropriate for me to mention how this all came about. That I recorded my grandfather, because the idea was not originally there. I spent every week an evening with him for years, and we talked and conversed animatedly and had a good time. And that's when he offered me a drink and so on. And the room was full of his smoke, and eventually I started puffing a cigar too. But that was the byproduct. But I realized after such evenings that I had heard stories and facts about his background and the people he associated with in the Berlin phase, for instance, that I should write all this down. But towards midnight when I got home, I didn't have the energy to sit down and write this down. And that's when the idea was born in my head. Why don't I ask him if he has a problem, if I get a tape recorder and we put that on the coffee table between us, and it just runs for 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever. And that's what he agreed to do. He had no problem with it. And I recorded these things. And unfortunately, and then at that time, I also developed an attitude that I need to bring a little structure to the discussion, so that I wanted to go through his whole life progressively, chronologically, not in great detail, but in general terms. So there would be a structure to our discussions. And the only very regrettable fact is that he died before I got very far. Basically, our discussions ended with him explaining how the Bauhaus was closed. That's sort of the end, I think. Am I right, Fritz?
Yeah, if there is no tape.
Yeah, but there is nothing, no discussion about his beginning in Chicago, really, you know, in my tapes. Even though I had heard from him before without the tapes, and I have memories of some of the things. One of the wonderful little anecdotes which I may just comes to my mind. He lived in a hotel on Michigan Avenue, and to go to IIT, he had to take a taxi. He never drove in his life, so he never had a car or anything that he could drive. And he gets in a taxi and says with a heavy German accent, 33rd and State. This is the address, 33rd Street. And the taxi driver turns around and says, Ich bin von Pankow, von wo sind Sie? Der hat sofort festgestellt, dass das auch ein Deutscher ist.
Yeah. Maybe we should translate that into English for our international audience. So Pankow is part of Berlin. So it was a fellow German, the taxi driver. Dirk, Lohan, I was wondering, did you have conversations with your grandfather in which you would examine or critique works by other architects? Like I imagine artists who admire
sure.
a particular composer, or for his
Oh,
rhythm or
sure.
use of harmony.
We sure talked about other buildings that were being done at the time that are in the news or that you read about or hear about, and I was always interested what his reaction was. For instance, one thing, Gropius was involved in the Pan Am building in New York City, it's a major building there, and Mies did not like that building, so he was critical of it.
The New Yorkers didn't like it either.
Who?
The New Yorkers.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but yes, that happens. That happened quite a bit.
He put it across Park Avenue. All other buildings stand in line, and Gropius placed his building just
Squarely in the avenue. Yeah,
into the avenue, and this didn't the New Yorkers didn't like at all.
Yeah.
And
Professor Neumeyer, I should say that you mentioned that in your introduction, and you draw a contrast between the Pan Am building by Gropius and the Seagram building by Mies. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, Mies, in the conversation, Mies, where they speak about Gropius, then Mies mentions it, and they speak about the Bauhaus exhibition 1923. And Mies, I mean, it's amazing. He remembers precisely the desk that Gropius designed for the director's office, and he calls it more or less just an ornament. It was not ornamented, but the whole thing it was an ornament. And then he drops a remark about the Pan Am building, and the main argument he brings up against Gropius, that Gropius is a formalist, that he's not really constructing things, and whereas the Pan Am is such a formal gesture, whereas the Seagram building is a high-rise building that speaks about construction. So for him, Gropius was a decoration. He calls it also firlefanz.
And that's hard to translate.
Firlefanz, yes, is hard to translate. But that was for him this attitude, to design something without having a deeper and essential understanding of the building task, of the materials, and of course of the urban situation. So I mean that just the position of the Pan Am building is a provocation. It's no other building in New York that just is built across the street and wants to adopt the position as a point of view.
Mm-hmm. Whereas the Seagram building was often praised for its setback, which gave rise to a public urban space, right?
He steps back from the front and allows a public space. It's a very decent gesture. It's just the complete opposite gesture, to putting yourself in the middle of the world, but to step back and allow space for the human beings and to allow public space.
Well, I think this is also, one could say, his personal character. He was a modest man and didn't seek attention, although he was very certain of his convictions, and to him, what he believed in was very, very important, and he wouldn't deviate from it at all. But I was always amazed how modest and simple he was, and I found that to be a wonderful quality about him.
And what do you think? Which role did, in general, the social question play in his work? Did it play any role at all? So did he think that one could solve social problems with the help of architecture?
Well, the social space or the public spaces, yes. I mean, there are several of his buildings, like the Chicago Federal Center, for instance. There's a wonderful public space created, surrounded by the three buildings, where there's a Alexander Calder sculpture. And it's also a space where people can congregate and express themselves as citizens against the federal government and so on. So, I mean, he was very interested in that, and city building and the impact of buildings in a city mattered to him, although he's not particularly, shall we say, has not, I think, written or said very much about urban design. That he left to Hilbs. Fritz, you could maybe add something here.
Yes, that's true. But Mies has his understanding of space. I would say his understanding of space by nature is somehow social, because it's the idea that people can live in a rather unrestricted manner in spaces and communicate with another as the spaces can communicate. And that the relation is not only to be seen in terms of space between inside and outside, but also in this interconnection with the environment of the building. So it is an understanding of a building which is somehow, let's say, rooted into its environment, yes, and therefore also in its social space. And Mies had an understanding of urbanism, which I labeled this to plant or to insert islands of order into the chaotic city. He speaks about the chaotic city and that we have to give order to it. And in these terms, the spaces Mies is building are ordered spaces that allow public space. And I think he is really a genius in these terms. If he builds two buildings, they form a space, you know? He knows how to place and to put two objects in order to create a spatial tension between them and to create a sensible a space, not just something which is left over and can be used, but it's really an articulated urban space which has its own quality of being out there.
A very good example of that, in my opinion, is his design and planning for the campus of Illinois Institute of Technology, which he did when he came to Chicago and literally during the war years. And when you look at that carefully, he placed the buildings on a grid. He developed a grid pattern which grew out of the Jeffersonian street grid in America. And the relationship, the distance, the spacing between buildings and pieces or portions of the buildings to each other is all very carefully composed. Yeah. And it's actually a very interesting and compelling environment with landscaping as the softener of the art spaces. Yeah.
Mies had a sense for the social life of buildings. You know, this is what I'm saying. The buildings that can communicate, they are not solipsistic entities, but they are buildings that have a quality to address something. That's a rather Schinkelian understanding also. If you think of his buildings, he also inserts individual buildings that are able to communicate across the space with another.
Now, Chicago was mentioned a couple of times already. The city played a large role for Mies, apparently, and it also does for you, Mr. Lohan.
Yes, yes.
You decided to settle there permanently after your studies, as far as I know.
Yes.
You've been there, well...
Since '62, permanently.
Right.
Yeah.
And many of your buildings are erected there. For example, residential high-rises, company headquarters, the Oceanarium I already mentioned. what meaning does the city have for you? And in your eye, from your perspective, how does Chicago compare to European cities like Berlin, for example?
It's quite different. American cities are different, and Chicago is actually a very young city. Even in the United States, it only began to be thought of as a town or city in the middle of the 19th century. And it developed rather rapidly because there's an interesting confluence here. We have the Great Lakes system, the Great Lake Michigan, and then a river system that connects us to the Mississippi. So you could actually, by boat, go over the lakes, through the rivers, down the Mississippi to New Orleans. That became, of course, a great big connection and artery of trade and commerce. And Chicago is at the juncture of these two systems. So anyway, Chicago, I like to always compare it a little bit to Berlin, because Berlin is not a very old city either. And today, the Chicago, the city is 3.5 or 4 million people, and the metropolitan region, which is really all part of it, is about 9 million people. So but the way city planning was not done in the United States in the beginning, basically it was the rule of capitalism. Whoever bought a piece of property could build whatever they wanted to build there. And that's where you get a very often very chaotic and not well-connected contextual image of the city. However, because we have Lake Michigan and a shoreline with wonderful sandy beaches here, and naturally, the early urban planners and industrialists that developed this town, luckily they put some parks along the lake, and the park system is extensive, goes all the way up and down the city, and it's publicly accessible, the beachfront anywhere. And so Chicago has a very beautiful side, which is downtown and along the lake. And then there are other neighborhoods that need help and need development in the future, and particularly now with the discussion that goes on in the United States about Black Lives Matter. You may have heard about that.
Yeah.
There is a great need for better housing for the African American population, and so on and so on. But it is, in my opinion, to a degree, a very fascinating, interesting city. And architecturally, there are many wonderful buildings here. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright was here with his home here. Louis Sullivan was here, and now Mies was here. I mean, it's a great capital of architecture.
Yeah. And if I may remark, the Chicago School of Architecture is to a large degree Schinkelschule. You know, there are many German architects that emigrated in the 1840s. In Chicago, the first architectural magazine was founded by German architects. They celebrated Schinkel's birthday every year. And if you look at a couple of buildings, you can see that the system of the Building Academy of Schinkel or of the Schauspielhaus, that you find it if you see, for example, the Leiter building or so. It's Schinkel tectonics is a part of the first high-rise architecture. So it's large degree, it's really Berlin School of Architecture.
Well, originally the largest ethnic population in Chicago was Germans. Yeah. There were 2 daily newspapers in town, German-speaking newspapers.
Amazing.
Yeah, they have all moved to the suburbs now. There's very little German ethnic activity here. Unlike the Poles, we have 600,000 Polish people in Chicago. It's supposed to be the second largest Polish city in the world after Warsaw.
Dirk Lohan, you took over Mies's practice after his death. Now you already said that it was important for you, of course, to have your own style, your own perspective of things. Did you sometimes feel a burden, a responsibility, at least, to carry on with that tradition, with Mies's tradition?
To a degree, but also because I was, I mean, whatever I've done, I was convinced that's the right way to go. And the office continued after his death for just a short few years with two other partners, and then one of them split off and the other one died. And then it became Lohan Associates for many years. And I have done probably as many, if not more, buildings than Mies has done in Chicago.
Yes.
So you could say our family has had a profound impact. I mean, in addition to the Oceanarium, I did the museum campus plan, I did the football stadium, I did the aquarium and the planetarium and an art museum and so on. So it's very many public buildings along our lakefront here.
You mentioned that you will be traveling to Berlin soon, or hopefully. We don't know, of course, how the situation.
Well, I've been involved in the restoration effort with David Chipperfield for the Neue Nationalgalerie, and Fritz Neumeyer was also a consultant to that team. And that construction period is now ending this year, hopefully. And there's, at this point, there's talk about a ceremony in December. We'll see if that happens. Unfortunately, it's become so difficult to travel internationally that nobody goes back and forth anymore.
Right.
I hope the borders will open again.
Yes. So fingers crossed. Maybe that will give us a chance to meet in person finally.
Yes.
My last question goes to both of you, and it's a rather big question, but let's see. What do you think will remain of Mies's legacy in the 21st century, or rather, what is his legacy for the 21st century?
Fritz, you better start this.
That's a really a difficult, serious question of the legacy. Whether there is a Mies legacy direct or not, I wouldn't see that, because the way of building has changed so dramatically from the times of 1960s, 50s of Mies and until today. If we just think of the thermic insulations and so on, so the pure steel and glass building is no longer an option that we really take as a model. But I think in terms of architectural understanding, I would say Mies will always have an impact, because Mies is an architectural architect. He's not someone who's designing form as form. And in our current architecture, we see that the form, the image has taken over architecture. And Mies is someone also in terms of transforming things. So Mies is able to transform something old into new, and something new into something which looks like it belongs to a great tradition. So this is for me an amazing quality in the work of Mies, so that he is able to have this freedom also, you know, being against conventions, be it modern conventions or traditional conventions. So this independency and this autonomy of thinking and understanding and making architecture. This, I believe, will be a model for an architect as long as our discipline continues to exist.
Yes, that's very well said. I would say his main legacy will, of course, be 20th century and the emergence of technology and the incorporation of serious thought of how to express the modern times and the advancement of technology in his buildings. And as time goes on, and I would say since his life, the middle of the 20th century, we're approaching not too far away, the middle of the 21st century, there are already major changes going on. Just think about the aspect of environmental concern, climate change, and the sustainability and the carbon captured production of materials and building. And these will shape the future for architecture in a major way, in my opinion. In fact, I'm just enrolled in a research conference where this will be discussed next week. And I think if Mies was around, he would embrace these concerns as well, even though during his time that was not much of a concern. For instance, the building I'm living in has single glazing. In other words, only one sheet of glass between the inside and the outside, and metal frames, so that the heat and cold transfer in and out is not advanced by today's technology. But I don't say that as a criticism. It was just not a concern. In fact, he told me once, I remember when I first was very young, I said, how come you still do single glass in buildings when at Münchner Universität, Technische Hochschule, you would flunk, your design wouldn't be accepted if you did that. You had to do insulated buildings. And of course, the experience in Europe of the war years taught everybody to be very more conscious of this. And that's why today Europe is more ahead than the United States in these concerns. But it's growing in a big way now here in this country, considering what's going on with our storms and our fires, etc. I mean, people have to think about these things. But in an indirect way, in a philosophical way, that's all part of the legacy of Mies, to think about these things and incorporate them and express them in forms and solutions that are humane.
Mm-hmm.
Herr Lohan, Herr Neumeyer, again, thank you very much. It was a very interesting and I think also very insightful conversation. And thanks, of course, also to our audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Fritz. It was nice to see you.
Yeah, hope to see you soon in Berlin.
Yeah, okay.